Welcome, everybody. Hello. Are we good to go? All righty. Well, hello and welcome, everybody, to AMS Weather Band's last webinar for today, day one of the Jamposium. But don't forget, we have day two tomorrow as well. But this final presentation today is Climate Conversations, Bridging Science, Stories, and Solutions with Bruno Takahashi, Julie Doyle, Paul Higgins, and our moderator, Melanie Snow. Now, before we begin, though, we would like to address some of the guidelines for the webinar. If you have any questions during the webinar, please put them in the YouTube chat that should be to the right of your viewing screen when you're looking at it on your computer. We will have dedicated time for audience questions after the presentation, but as questions arise during the flow of the presentation, if any questions fit appropriately within the conversation taking place, they may be asked at that point in time as well. Additionally, all communications should be appropriate for a professional audience that includes individuals from diverse backgrounds. So please be inclusive and respectful in your interactions. Now I'd like to introduce today's presenters. So thank you again, Bruno, Julie, and Paul and Melanie. Thank you so much. Melanie is our moderator for today. Melanie Snow is a former high school science teacher that currently works as a learning experience designer at Cognity. She has spent the past 2 decades in science education as both a teacher and researcher with a focus on NGSS. She holds a PhD in learning sciences from the University of Illinois, Chicago, and a master's of education. I believe that's correct, Melanie? All right. In science education from Georgia State University and a BS in Earth and Atmospheric Sciences from the Georgia Institute of Technology. As a Florida native, she credits her love of weather from experiencing Hurricane Elena in middle school. And with that, Melanie, I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Gideon. We have our panelists today, Julie, Paul, and Bruno, and I'd like to take some time to introduce each of them to you. First up, our first panelist will be Paul Higgins. He is an Associate Executive Director of the American Meteorological Society and a Senior Scientist with the AMS Policy Program. Paul specializes in global change and its causes, consequences, and potential solutions. He created AMS Climate Policy Colloquium and leads AMS's Science Policy Colloquium. In 2011, he was named a Google Science Communications Fellow. And from 2005 to 2006, he was a Congressional Science Fellow in the United States Senate, where he worked on climate policy. He was a National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellow at the University of California and a fellow of the Department of Energy's Global Change Education Program. Dr. Higgins received a PhD and an MS degree from Stanford University and a BS from the University of Michigan. In 1978, he invented wall scaling, though possibly not for the first time. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Paul, our first panelist. Take it away.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you to the organizers for including me on the panel and my co-panelists for joining me on the panel. And thanks to all of you for joining us for this session on climate conversations and bridging science, stories, and solution. I want to start just at the outset by distinguishing among three ways of thinking about climate change and climate change science. So the first way that climate change comes up is the process of scientific advancement, which is really discussion, debate, advances in knowledge and understanding that occur within the relevant technical audiences. So subject matter experts who focus on climate change and are familiar with the full body of evidence relating to climate change. So that's where scientific discourse and debates occur. Second area is scientific communication. So it's the process by which the scientific knowledge and understanding is made available to public audiences so that the technical issue is received by broader audiences. And then a third is policy deliberation for issues like climate change that are public issues and that whether or not we do something about climate change as a public issue and what we do, where those deliberations occur. I'm really couching my discussion today around that second type of scientific communication for broad audiences. And it really raises the question of how do we help broad audiences that aren't focused on a daily basis with the evidence relating to a scientific topic. How do we help translate that scientific information so that those who have access to it understand it in the same way that the scientists who are working on it on a daily basis do, and are enabled to use that information, recognizing that they bring their own perspectives to those issues. So with that background, I want to focus on three primary overarching messages that result from decades of intensive examination of the climate system and the impact that people are having on it. So the first conclusion of the science is that climate change is dangerous. The second, that people are causing it. And the third, that we have reasons to believe that we can likely still deal with climate change and thrive. So reasons for optimism. So those are the three topics that I want to speak to with my 10 minutes or so. So this first one, climate change is dangerous. Why is that the case? Climate change that are occurring now, that people are causing today, are larger and faster than any humanity is known to have endured over the last 10,000 years. So that's well before people transitioned from hunting and gathering to agriculture. It's well before the inventions of the wheel and the writing. So effectively, the changes in climate that people are causing now are unprecedented in anything like what we have thought about or understand as human experience over the last 10,000 years. And that's concerning because climate is a foundation of life for all people and all beings. Climate is a foundation. What do I mean by that? Well, the Earth's physical characteristics, where oceans and coasts meet, the weather patterns and what weather occurs in what locations, where ice and snow occur throughout the year, the physical characteristics of the planet are all shaped by, if not defined by, climate. In addition, biological systems and the goods and services that biological systems provide to us are also heavily shaped by climate. And finally, our societal creations, where and how we live, how we produce and collect food, how we manage water resources, our built infrastructure, all of them account for the climate that occurs in the locations where they're built and designed. So these physical, biological, and social systems are all central to human well-being, and they are highly sensitive to changes in climate. And all of that makes climate change dangerous. We know that people are causing climate change. We have had decades of intensive research on the climate system and the impact that people are having on the climate system. We have multiple independent lines of evidence that confirm that people are causing climate to change. And that evidence, the evidence that people are causing climate to change, has been assessed comprehensively by independent subject matter experts and under the auspices of different independent scientific institutions. And I want to just take a moment to build on that, because it's one of the reasons why public audiences can have strong confidence in the assessments of climate science. So when you look at scientific institutions like the US National Academy of Sciences, the American Meteorological Society, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, all of whom have assessed the science of climate change and reached broadly similar conclusions, reconfirmed what the scientific evidence tells us, accuracy is central to the credibility of those scientific institutions, and all of them represent many fields of science. So if they get one field of science wrong, if they misrepresent science in any way, it reduces their impact and credibility in other branches of science. And that's a really powerful check to ensure that when they are assessing evidence, they do so conscientiously and in ways that accurately convey what we know and understand. And I'll just add, as a final point, I'm not familiar with any scientific organization with relevant subject matter expertise in climate that has reached broadly contradictory conclusions than the assessments that have occurred by those scientific organizations that I've mentioned. Okay, so the final point that I want to raise today is that there are some very important reasons to believe that we can likely still deal with climate change and thrive. So reasons for some cautious optimism. I think these are important to recognize and keep front and center in our thinking. The first is that we have made initial and meaningful progress in addressing climate change. As an illustration, the United States is currently on a path to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases by 40% by 2030 relative to 2005. So 40% reduction relative to 2005 by the end of this decade. That leaves a lot of work to be done to address emissions, but it is a clear indication that some progress has been made. I think it's also really important to recognize that no one seeks to emit greenhouse gases or to change climate. Greenhouse gas emissions and climate change are unintended byproducts of activities that we engage in. They're unintended byproducts of basic needs and things that we need, but they aren't themselves necessary. And we have alternatives available to us and that can be further developed that meet those basic needs without emitting greenhouse gases. And then finally, there are a wide range of response options for addressing climate change, many of which can be expected to be broadly beneficial to society. And maybe we can talk about that to some degree as we go forward. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our next panelist, which is Bruno Takahashi. Bruno is the Brandt Endowed Professor of Environmental Communication at Michigan State University. He holds a joint appointment in the School of Journalism and Ag Bio Research and serves as the research director at the Knight Center for Environmental Journalism. He earned his bachelor's degree in communication from Universidad de Lima, Peru, and his MS and PhD in environmental science from SUNY ESF in the United States. His current research focuses on news coverage of environmental issues, environmental journalism practices in Latin America and US Latino media, and identity and science communication. He is also affiliated with the Health and Risk Communication Center, the Environmental Science and Policy Program, and the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at Michigan State University. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Bruno.
Thank you, Melanie. Pleasure being here, and thanks to everyone who helped organize this and everyone online listening. I'm going to share my screen. I have just a few slides to make a few points. All right, so I think Paul made a great presentation and laid out some basic issues in the communication of climate change to a range of different audiences. I'm going to continue building on those ideas. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that I'm currently doing, some work that I've done, also a little bit of how I got here to this point. for most people, climate change is an issue that it's experienced either through mediated means, but in some cases directly. In my particular experience, although I haven't directly experienced the impacts of climate change, it was a personal experience that led me to think more about how we communicate and how we make sense of a very abstract and oftentimes intangible issue. I mean, I live here in East Lansing, Michigan, and oftentimes it's hard to, when talking to students and colleagues, to explain to them how is climate change affecting you in your day-to-day, because for most people, at least around these areas, again, people in college town like East Lansing, it's not something that people are experiencing. So again, a lot of folks are experiencing climate change through mediated means. I remember I was in Peru in the Peruvian Andes about 25 years ago, visiting this particular glacier called Pastoruri. This was in the year 2000. I wanted to go back a few years ago and take some students on a study abroad trip, but I was told that it was probably not the best idea to go to this particular glacier because it was pretty much gone. And the image in 20, and you can see the images here on the screen how it has receded in the last several years. So for me, it was a little personal. I'm thinking about how we're making sense of this slow onset crisis, which is, again, one of the characteristics of climate change. I ended up going to a different glacier. This is me with my Michigan State flag at the Laguna 69, Lagoon 69 in the Peruvian Andes. But so again, this is one example of, again, how some folks make sense of climate change. But for the most part, the work that I'm doing and what I want to share with you is how different audiences, diverse audiences, have different ways to interpret and make sense of information that they consume from multiple sources. So I'm going to talk about three particular cases that I've been involved with. So the first one is this effort called the Lancet Countdown. Maybe some of you are familiar with this, that explores the intersection of climate change and public health, which has been a focus in the last several years to make climate change much more tangible, particularly for policymakers. So the focus of this work is largely on making the intersection of these two crises visible to particularly in policymakers in Latin America. The Lancet Countdown focuses on various different regions around the world. I'm involved with the Latin America group. So we published a series of articles highlighting, again, some of these issues in the academic literature. So these are some of the reports, some of the articles we've published. That's the team that has been involved with producing these reports. And the idea with this is that policymakers have a very limited attention to many issues. So we know that policymakers make decisions not necessarily based on facts and based on scientific information. They are motivated by a series of different factors. In many cases, in perhaps most cases, they're motivated by the prospects of being reelected into office. So their decision making oftentimes does not follow what we would think it's rational decision making or fact-based decision making. So what we try to do with these reports, of course, we conduct the research, we present the science in the form of these reports, but we also make very intentional efforts to bring this information in a much more digestible way. So things like one-page policy briefs to events that we organize, and we invite policymakers to participate and make it much more tangible to their constituencies. So we would explain to them that not necessarily that this is going to get them reelected, but that focusing on the intersection of climate and public health will benefit their populations that they are supposed to serve. And we talk about the co-benefits of, for example, of mitigating greenhouse gases that will also lead to better health outcomes related to the respiratory diseases. So we're, again, thinking about how policymakers access information and again, the best way to present hard data and scientific evidence that is digestible and that is actionable. So it's not only presenting the the data and the research, but saying these are the things that these are the range of policy options that could be pursued. We don't advocate for a particular policy option because that's not our role, but we make visible those different policy options. So for decision makers, again, it's a very particular way of communicating that it's differs significantly from perhaps public audiences, which is the second case study I want to highlight. Here in the state of Michigan, I did a study a couple of years ago focused on Latin American immigrants. So if we think about the diversity of populations, diversity of audiences in different contexts, talking specifically here about the US and Michigan more specifically, we find that there are, again, audiences that differ based on their socioeconomic status, their migratory status, their culture, their language, their scientific expertise or knowledge, their values, their attitudes, their political ideologies, etc. So for any form of communication that attempts to create some type of impact on an audience, and that could mean changing attitudes, changing behaviors, increasing knowledge, we have to be very mindful about those differences among audiences. So in this particular case, Latin American immigrants have a series of different concerns that perhaps are not necessarily explicitly aligned with the urgency of climate change. So things like immigration, things like job security, legal status, things like community building are much more salient. Local issues are much more salient than perhaps, again, climate change is an abstract issue, which requires communicators who want to reach these audiences of making those messages much more relevant to day-to-day issues of Latin American immigrants or whichever audience we're talking about. So in addition to that, what we've been doing with some of this work is looking at, again, some of those information sources that Latin American audiences in the US are accessing. And some of them have to do, are very specific ethnic Spanish language media that not necessarily cover climate change in ways that we would expect them to cover for this particular audience. So a recent study that we did looking at newspapers here in the US, their coverage of climate change, shows that the coverage resembles mainstream news coverage of climate change in the US. So it does not localize the issue for Latin American audiences. It does not talk specifically about the impacts, for example, for farm workers that are largely Hispanic or Latin American in populations. So what this means is that there is a sort of a gap in information. But however, when we look at surveys that have been done, studies that have been done based on surveys, we see that Latin American, Hispanic, or Latino audiences more broadly have higher levels of concern about climate change than their white counterparts or even Black populations. So there is a little bit of a contradiction, of a paradox here of why do certain populations have higher levels of concern for this abstract issue when they are not accessing that information directly from the information sources that they're consuming, such as Spanish language newspapers or CNN and Univision, which is a current study that I'm doing. So again, thinking about those, the uniqueness of the populations. And the third one that I want to highlight is more of a generational differences between audiences. A few years ago, we did a study looking at TikTok and how content creators generated information about climate change. The takeaway from this study, I think it's perhaps again telling of the uniqueness of each one of these different audiences, is that the accuracy, and then this is going on, following on what Paul was saying, the accuracy of the TikToks was highly questionable. There was a lot of issues with the accuracy of information presented by young content creators. However, the platform, if you're all familiar with TikTok, I'm sure most of you are, or at least have heard about it, has a series of affordances that few other social media platforms have. And that allows content creators to appeal to emotions and affect rather than to knowledge and cognition, which means that people are engaging with climate change regardless of the accuracy of the information. Now, that could lead certainly to issues later down the road, but the main takeaway of this study is that it's more about affect than it is about the content itself. And most of these TikToks are asking and calling for action related to climate change. So most of the stuff that we look was not, there was no skepticism about climate change. There was pretty much agreement that this was an issue and there was a call to action, regardless again of the accuracy of that information. So again, just another example that there are generational differences, and there are again differences based on language, based on socioeconomic status, attitudes, values, etc., among diverse audiences around the world, and that our communication strategies should be mindful of those differences. So I'm going to stop there and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Bruno. Our last panelist today is Julie Doyle. Julie is a professor of media and communication in the School of Art and Media at the University of Brighton, UK. Over the last 2 decades, Julie's research has examined the role of media, visual, communication, and popular culture in shaping societal understandings of responses to climate change. Author of Mediating Climate Change, her research has been cited in the UN's IPCC Scientific Assessments Reports in 2018 and 2022. And Julie also works collaboratively with artists and young people to co-create climate communication, and has provided consultancy on climate communication to government, NGOs, and businesses. She is proud to have grown up in Liverpool, which means being a football fan or soccer fan for us US folks, and a popular music fan. And at this time, I will turn it over to Julie.
Thank you so much, Melanie, and thank you to the Society for inviting me to speak. I'm really delighted and pleased to be here. So I'm just going to turn on my presentation. Okay. So who am I? Well, thank you, Melanie, for introducing me. I just wanted to start because the topic we're talking about is personal stories. So my climate communication story began about 30 years ago, and that was in the mid-1990s. At the time, I was an undergraduate literature student, but during that time, I became a volunteer for a local Greenpeace group in the UK. And at the time, engaging the public about climate change in the mid-90s was very difficult. A lot of the public said, we can't see it, therefore it's not happening. This was exacerbated, I guess, by the fact that Greenpeace itself was themselves a very visually oriented campaign group. So at the time, if you think about the mid-1990s, there was very little visual language that was established around climate change apart from those related to science, so scientific computer models and graphs. So given that visual language is a really important way of communicating about climate change beyond science, this kind of language had to be actively created. So this led me about 20 years ago in the mid-2000s to reflect on those early campaigning experiences that I'd had, and to ask now from an academic perspective, how is climate change made meaningful through images and texts? And those questions fueled my interest in climate communication. And so I began exploring some early climate communication in the making. So these are just some early examples from Greenpeace in the 1990s. So my academic background is media and communication studies. So from that perspective, I work from the premise that climate change is a cultural and a communicative issue. How we make sense of climate change is dependent upon how it's communicated and what values are communicated, who's made responsible, and what actions are encouraged. So communication on or about climate change shapes our understanding, and also thinking enabling us to think or not about different ways of living or different futures. So over the last 20 years, I've undertaken research into how climate change is visually communicated and textually communicated through different forms of media and popular culture, climate activism, corporate communication, science, and arts. And just a very early example, the bottom image on the left, which is from a BP advert from 2005. This shows how BP, obviously, is a fossil fuel company. They invented the term the carbon footprint, which is very much about individual responsibility to reduce your carbon footprint, and at the sense, and then at the expense of the collective responsibility of BP as a fossil fuel company. And this has come recently again into the fore because yesterday it was announced that BP are removing their commitment to renewable energy. Another example of an early example is the one that's next to it on the right, Meat's Not Green. This is from 2008. This was People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, their youth group, and they were one of the first to make the links between meat production and consumption and global carbon emissions. And you can see that through image choice and word choice. And what's interesting, you'll see in the knot is a kind of recycling logo. So you can see how the difficulty of trying to link kind of this issue with climate change and using kind of readily available symbols like a recycling sign. So over the last 10 years, I've worked increasingly in more interdisciplinary, creative and collaborative ways, and that's been with non-academic partners and a range of different publics or communities to see how climate communication works in practice. And I'm going to talk briefly about two projects that I've worked collaboratively with young people that focused on storytelling and communication. But I just wanted to highlight some of the kind of communication principles that guide that work that's kind of drawn upon my own research, but also the research of other climate communication scholars. So these are the principles that kind of underpin some of my work. Climate change, as we said, needs to be made personally relevant. It needs to be linked to people's everyday lives and their cultural practices. It needs to be made meaningful, not abstract. It needs to be linked to the things that people value. Climate change also needs to link to issues of social justice. We understand climate change is a systemic issue. It affects groups disproportionately. So this is about empowering groups and marginalized groups and addressing power relations as well. We also need to be able to imagine and to communicate equitable climate futures to be able to kind of work towards them and to help create them. There's definitely a distinct lack of credible kind of futuring in mainstream media. So how are we supposed to, engage in public discussions about ways forward if that discussion is not happening? And then finally, collaborate with different audiences across different disciplines and practices, across the natural sciences, the social sciences, arts and humanities, to co-produce new climate stories and new forms of communication. As we know, we work better together and collectively. So I'm going to move on to just talk about two projects that I was involved in. The first one was called Future Coast Youth, and this used speculative storytelling, so kind of future storytelling and play that was participatory. And this was to engage a group of young people, 14 to 15-year-old teenagers with climate change, but we specifically wanted them to think of climate change as a cultural issue. These were environmental science students, and we wanted to see whether this would increase their self-efficacy around climate engagement. This project happened before the Youth Climate Strikes. The idea for this was based on the online digital storytelling project by US games designer Ken Eklund, which asked audiences to imagine and create voicemails from a range of climate futures. So with the support of Ken Eklund, we refocused the project in situ in Brighton in the UK with those group of students. The students were addressed throughout as the fictional Future Coast Youth team dedicated to addressing climate change through positive action. And they were introduced to the project through a kind of immersive play event where we all kind of played different characters and acted out kind of dialogue in a kind of democratic way. And then the young people created their own voicemails from the future. What followed was a series of creative workshops where the students produced their own communication on climate change. of their choice. So this is a range of some of the outputs. And then what they did was they then presented those outputs to an external audience through a final immersive play event, which took place during the real events of COP21 in Paris. And the young people decided to present themselves as the Future Coast Youth Climate Delegation from the future. Obviously, happening in real time was a real kind of climate conference. What we found when they first did their voicemails was that the visions of the future were a mixture of dystopic or dystopia and techno solutions. Through the process of the creative workshops, the young people reflected back that the creative process and the playfulness had kind of helped them with their group bonding. It increased their levels of confidence in communicating about climate change. So what we learned from this was there definitely needs to be more educational opportunities for young people to explore creative and interdisciplinary kind of understandings of climate change. So the second project I'm briefly going to talk about was called Climates. This was a collaborative research project that brought 20 young people from across Europe together to participate in a 5-day climate communications retreat that took place in St. Gilgen in Austria. And the retreat kind of foregrounded transformational principles of interdisciplinary learning and multidimensional learning. So thinking about not just the cognitive, but the emotional, the intuitive, the relational. And the explicit focus was on communication was really central to that retreat. So the participants were given an information on climate science and also climate communication research. And throughout the retreat, there were opportunities for storytelling, emotional engagement, arts and music. The goal was to get the young people to group up together and create their own climate communications that was targeted at young people on a topic of their choice. These were some of the campaigns that they ended up creating themselves. This was after the retreat, and much of this was kind of done online. Shall I go back? The young people, we interviewed them directly at the retreat and then 6 months later. And what they all said was that the collective experience, the peer-to-peer learning was really important. And what came across really strongly was the sharing of complex emotions was really, really key around climate change. They really appreciated the interdisciplinary learning and the kind of goal focus of the retreat. They talked about this as a transformative experience in terms of changing their worldviews and increasing their sense of efficacy. This efficacy was particularly through emotional bonding. They also identified lifestyle and behavioural changes around meat consumption and also transport. And they also talked about intrinsic value changes in terms of what's a good life mean. So just to summarise, communicating climate change means communicating a range of cultural stories about climate change. That helps bridge the gap between abstract data and the cultural meanings of everyday life. Participation is a crucial process when people feel part of the story, making they take ownership and feel empowered. Doing this collectively and across disciplines is really important to support kind of co-creation and working together. And collaboration and community building can create a sense of hope and joy, which is much needed. And I'm just going to finish on an image which I think encapsulates all that we kind of experienced on that retreat and thinking about ways forward, about being hopeful and working collectively together. So thank you for your time and listening.
Thank you so much, Julie. I love that picture at the end. At this time, I want to thank our panelists for all of those talks. It's so interesting to hear all these different perspectives. And I'm going to open it up to a discussion between our panelists. I want to start off with an idea that I heard that sort of connects these three talks together. And it started with Paul talking about how this is a public issue. And Julie and Bruno both sort of brought up these ideas of like the visual nature of climate change. Bruno, you had those lovely or not so lovely pictures of glaciers going away. And, Julie, you talked about these representations. And so my question is, if there is no way for a population or an individual to connect with like the visual impact of climate change, then how do you see them taking any kind of like personal ownership, or how do you see them getting connected with the idea of climate change being real?
Well, I can start us off. I think one of the challenges that has been persistent with climate change, and that is really an issue with any effort to take a technical issue and convey what those who focus on a daily basis on that technical issue to communicate it in such a way that audiences will hear what is being conveyed in the same way that the person who's speaking or presenting intends. And that's a really challenging issue. It's a challenge. It's been a challenging issue with climate change. There has been public misinformation about climate change, which makes it even harder. But the question is really how do you take what the people who are focused on the topic and are familiar comprehensively with the scientific evidence, how do you take what they know and understand and communicate it to a broad audience? That's very difficult. And I think what my colleagues on the panel described is very important. So when you can show it, when you can connect it back to people's lives, when you can offer an analogy or an illustration that helps make that be real for people, I think it's really powerful. And I think the scientific community uses language that's very specific and doesn't connect with people. And so just as one illustration of that, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change talks about probabilities and likelihoods, and it has very well-defined descriptions of what's of likelihood, how likely something is to occur, how strongly we know what we think we know, how conclusive the evidence is. And all of that language is very effective for technical audiences, but it doesn't mean the same thing to a non-technical audience as it means to that technical audience. So images, anecdotes, stories, connecting it to people's lives is hugely important for having that information filter to people in the way that that means the same thing as the person or group of experts that are presenting it.
I can jump in. A couple of things come to mind. When I hear your question, Melanie, about how to make climate change real and more like tangible for people who might not experience it firsthand or might not have a visual representation of it, I think about two related things. First is from a strategic communication perspective, is what do we want to accomplish with making climate change relevant or real or tangible, right? So what is it that we want to achieve with that communication? I mean, typically when we think about communication, of course, there's different forms of communication. There's relational communication, there's dialogic communication, there's more unidirectional communication. But what do we want to achieve, right? It's a change of behavior, like mitigating behavior and adaptation behavior, or what is it, right? So that's one thing. The second thing that comes to mind is that when we think about climate change, it's such a broad and abstract concept, right? And it's a social construction, really. I mean, what does it really mean, right? And as Paul was saying, it just means different things to different people across the world. For some people, the concept of climate change doesn't exist. If you think about indigenous populations, many indigenous populations have not even heard about this term. They might experience something that we might construe as climate change. but they might not call it that way. But within that definition of climate change that we in kind of the sciences use, I mean, we can break it down into like three major things, right? So it's causes, impact, solutions, right? And I think it matters in what is it again, what we're trying to achieve, and then what are we trying to highlight? Because for a lot of people, climate change is just overwhelming that if we continue communicating about the crisis and the urgency and the need, there's this fatigue and there's this paralyzing effect of that messaging, as opposed to more of an efficacy type of messaging that might get people to do something about it. And I think Julie was talking more about hope and that kind of framing that I think is more empowering for people. So I think there's a couple of, I mean, it's a great question, but I think we have to think about the nuances of what we're trying to achieve.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree with Bruno. In some sense, I don't think the issue is we need more science or the science needs to be communicated in a different way. I think it's about how do you make climate change tangible. But for me, it's thinking about you start where people are at, what are they interested in, what are their hobbies, what are they doing, and then it's thinking how can you link climate change to those hobbies. One might be that those hobbies might be being impacted by climate change. So you said I was a soccer fan, football, people who are working, in the UK anyway, even people who are working in grassroots football, often can't play because the pitch is wet and flooding. So that's one way you've started a conversation there. That's something that you love, that's a cultural practice, something that you value. It's a sense of community and belonging. What do you then do? That's a great way of kind of having that conversation. And also one of the issues is, I think, and this goes back to education and, for all of us, is that we're often taught that humans are separate from nature, and often media representations and the way that we think about ourselves as separate is one of the underlying challenges. Because if we can work towards the fact that everybody, we are part of we're interconnected, and so all of us are impacted by climate change and will be, and all of us are contributing in different ways. So it's thinking about that kind of holistic approach, and we can care about things that might not immediately directly impact us. So to wait for the impact to come to you in your local street or local community, in a sense, is too late. It's like we have to engage with people's capacity for care and ethics in different ways.
Yes, that's great. I like that idea of thinking about, like, if you wait until you can see it, it's probably too late, right?
Can I just say that's the issue around climate communication from the very beginning, and that's also when you look at the development, it's like the early communication from mainstream global north campaigning groups were like, trying to show that it was happening even though it wasn't visible. There are lots of those glacier images of loss, but it makes people feel, so it's not about the evidence of it being there. We've moved well past that. It's like, how do we integrate this? How do we empower people? I do recognize in the US there's a very different context going on at the moment, but I don't think we can let that, if we focus on making the science real or communicating the reality of the science, I think we're missing the point which has been made in the last 30 years that we need to communicate this in different ways.
That's a great point. One thing that you all brought up was the idea of climate change in the age of misinformation. So I'm wondering how the ideas that we've talked about, especially this idea of, meeting people where they are and showing them like something that they're interested in and how climate change is impacting those interests. How do you see that also being connected to the age of misinformation?
Well, to me, climate change is a good illustration of the challenges of misinformation, and I'll say as a public issue, climate change is a public issue, in my view, forces us to confront some of the broader issues and challenges that are facing our nation and that are facing our democracy, in a way that I think gets at your question. And I'll assert that there is no place for false information or for the rejection of available evidence in a highly functional democratic process. I mean, for people to be able to participate in decision making, they need to have access to the information that those decisions are partly based in. Now, having said that, science is one source of information. It's a key input to almost any policy decision or decision of any kind, but there are always additional factors that go beyond information. So there are always values and interests, personal preferences, who wins, who loses. All of that is tied up in any kind of decision, a policy decision, and what scientific information can do is help people understand the dimensions of the decision and the pros and cons. And as a result, science, when it's appropriately used and considered, is a central key ingredient to any decision, but it's never the last word, because interests and values are always a part of that. And I think climate change as a public issue forces us to see ways that misinformation and the information environment that we're in really can get in the way of national interests and the functioning of democracy. Because if we don't know and understand the issues and decisions that we're making, then it's not really an effective way for decision making.
I'm going to use that to segue to one of our audience questions. And we have a question from an audience member that asks, how can indigenous knowledge be integrated with modern scientific methods to enhance climate strategies and solutions?
That's a great question, and I'm not from a science background, but my initial response would be how we teach science has to be rethought in terms of integrating different worldviews and different approaches to science, what constitutes scientific knowledge. That example of just like the nature culture divide, which is very much kind of a Western scientific approach and epistemology that reinforces those, nature culture distinctions. If we're thinking, it's about historically situating all the knowledge systems that we work with and understanding how they are in some sense culturally constructed. That's not to deny climate change is real, but it is about how we learn about the world around us. So science training, science education, and then also working across those practices and coming together and working across disciplines and approaches and worldviews, being open to that.
To add to that, I fully agree with what Julie just said in terms of that dualist perspective. I'm currently working on a project in the Peruvian Amazon, and we're working with some indigenous groups that have a perspective about nature that is, again, very different from this dualistic perspective. And we're seeing a lot of movements within some countries, especially in the global south, of giving rights to nature, right? And personhood to, for example, rivers. In this particular case, in the Peruvian Amazon, it's legal personhood to a particular river. So the approach to caring for nature or working with nature or being part of nature, it's just very different from, again, that dualistic perspective. So it changes the paradigm of how do we deal with issues, not only climate change, but things like extractivism, such as oil exploration, for example, in the Amazon. So I think there is a need for us in this more traditional scientific community to be mindful and understanding about different ways of living and different ways of interacting and working within nature, so that we don't come from this paternalistic perspective that has traditionally been the way in which we have approached finding solutions to crisis. And so I think, and I don't have the answer how to actually put into place people that are doing much better work out there. But I do agree there's a need for us to be reflective and intentional about how do we approach working with different forms of ways of knowing.
Another question from the audience, which me as a parent, I think connects and resonates with me, is when we're talking about, you know, this separation between like the outside world and the human world and how we treat those differently, and then how we communicate those in school, the ways that we teach. I often think about, and apparently so does an audience member, I think about how do I communicate these things with my own child? So the audience member asked, what are some climate, or I'm sorry, what age should children be introduced to climate change?
Paul, you go. And I can...
Well, I mean, I was going to say, I'm not sure there's a hard and fast rule for me with respect to age, but I would say in communicating with any audience, my goal is to provide accurate information that's understood by that audience the way I intend it to be, and that helps them use that information. So if you think about that in the context of a kid, certainly I'm always thinking about how can I give people, in any case, in any instance, I'm thinking, how can I give the information that's the accurate information? I'm not going to pull punches. I'm not going to give, misinformation for any reason, but I also want that to be enabling and helpful to the person. And in the case of a child, obviously, I would be thinking about how does this, help them to be a happy child that's not doesn't have additional anxiety or anything like that. And so information that's age appropriate and that ideally allows people to make use of that information.
I'm just, quickly say, we know that children get more anxious as they get older, and anxiety increases. I think, that, of course, that's developmental, but it's also because I don't think we equip young people and children with the skills to be able to understand and to feel empowered around this issue. So even things like project-based learning that can happen at a younger age. So it's about, and it would address all those kind of transformational learning goals and principles, which are about kind of cognitive understanding, but emotional, intuitive, relational, goal-oriented, where they're working together. So you can address this issue, but in a way that is creating a young person's ability to contribute as they get older and to deal, to try and not have that overwhelm and despair, because they should have the skills and the tools to be able to kind of collaborate and work with each other. So I think we're doing them a disservice if we don't talk to them about but it's very clear it's about how we talk to young people about it and children and how we enable them.
I know this is something as an educator I think about a lot, right? Like how can I infuse the topics of climate change and learning about the world without creating anxiety, but also give students the tools so that they can have advocacy over making decisions that encompass scientific literacy in terms of how they will go about life and embodying different ways of thinking and doing that are connected to their environment. That's all the time we have for today. I wish we had more because I feel like we could talk all day about this. But I do want to thank everybody for joining us here and creating this panel, which I think was fantastic. I love talking with you all about this topic, as I hope our audience did. And I appreciate this conversation that we're able to have together today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, Julie, Bruno, Paul, and Melanie, of course, thank you so much for bringing that to the audience. That was very insightful, and I think we definitely picked up a lot. So thank you for everything. And this wraps up day one of AMS Weather Band's 2025 Jamposium. A big thank you to all of our presenters and moderators for their incredible insights, and to everyone who joined us for the sessions. Audience, if you have further questions or if you want to talk about the webinar, this one or the other ones that came before, members are welcome to bring that discussion to the AMS forum. But we are just getting started. Day 2 kicks off tomorrow at 12 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time with more exciting discussions, including ENSO and winter forecasting, home weather stations, and the wonders of atmospheric optics. So we hope to see you back for another day of learning, discussion, and community. Thank you again for joining us, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow. Have a good one. Bye.